Well, the federal government has urged Russia to abide by international law in its treatment of Australian fighter Oscar Jenkins. Russia says Mr Jenkins is still alive, months after being captured by its forces. Jennifer Parkin is an expert associate with the Australian National University's National Security College, and she joins us now. Thank you so much for your time today. Assuming that Oscar Jenkins is alive, what is his status right now? How do we classify him? Is he a prisoner of war? Is he a mercenary?
Thanks, Ruby, and thanks for having me on. And look, I'd like to start by extending my sympathies to the family of Oscar Jenkins, and also highlight that although we have heard that he is alive, there is a lot of propaganda and information operations associated with this conflict. So until we have proof, we certainly can't confirm that. On the question of how is Oscar Jenkins classified, well, certainly as a member of the Ukrainian armed forces fighting in that international armed conflict, Australia would classify him as a prisoner of war, and that comes from the Third Geneva Convention signed in 1949, of which Russia is a party to. There is a question though, because Russia has treated some international fighters fighting in this conflict as mercenaries, so notably in 2022 in Mariupol, a large city in Ukraine fell. There were 10 international fighters from countries such as UK, US, etc., where Russia actually treated them as mercenaries, put them through a show trial and executed them. Now, we haven't heard from the Russian government how they have classified Oscar Jenkins, but certainly, as I mentioned before, under international law, he is classified as a prisoner of war and should be subject to those protections.
Does that also mean he could potentially be used in a future prisoner swap?
So it certainly does. So under the Third Geneva Convention that talks about prisoners of war, it does allow for prisoner swaps. And we have seen during this nearly 3-year-long conflict over a dozen prisoner swaps. I think the latest was around New Year's, where we saw hundreds of prisoners transfer between Russia and Ukraine. So it's certainly feasible, and international law allows for it. We just have to be careful though in terms of expecting or thinking too much of Russia. Unfortunately, despite the protections afforded to prisoners of war under the Third Geneva Convention, the UN Commission of Inquiry into Ukraine released a report late last year that talked about significant abuses of prisoners of war, so torture, physical violence, etc. And Ukraine themselves, their prosecutors said that they think that Russia has executed about 147 prisoners of war. Now that is a war crime under international law, and those that commit those crimes can be held accountable. But I think we just need to realise that Russia is not necessarily complying with the international law for treatment of prisoners of war, even if they do classify Oscar Jenkins as a prisoner of war.
And what about Australia's perspective? How does Australia's legal system view people like Oscar Jenkins who travel to Ukraine to fight? Do they get support to return home, or support when they return home that former soldiers might receive that would be sorely needed, assuming he's been subjected to things like, torture and things like you've pointed to there?
Look, this is a kind of an ongoing conversation in Australia. Under the criminal code, it is legal for Australians to go and fight in foreign forces. So it is reported that Oscar Jenkins is a member of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is legal under Australian domestic law. It is not legal to go and fight in other countries if you're not part of the official armed forces. In terms of support for people returning, look, they're not members of the Australian Defence Force, so they're not afforded those supports that our Australian Defence Force women and men would be afforded. There is a real question about whether they should be. Certainly when people experience traumatic experiences like that, we do know that they do need assistance in integrating back in society. So I think there needs to be a civil conversation about this. The challenge though, and the balance for the government, is we don't want to incentivise Australians to be going overseas to fight in foreign armed forces or in international armed conflicts. So it is a balance, it is something that needs to be looked at. But I think we need to not get ahead of ourselves in this situation. Certainly, we know that in this conflict, as I mentioned before, there has been significant information operations, significant propaganda. So I think without proof that Oscar Jenkins is alive, we can't necessarily trust the word of Russia. And then, of course, there is the question of when he may be released. And under international law, under that Third Geneva Convention that I mentioned before, Russia does not have an obligation to release him until hostilities have ceased or as part of a prisoner swap.
Yeah, it's certainly important for the government, as you say, to disincentivise people from going to fight in these conflicts. And the official advice from the government is certainly do not travel. Do we have a sense, though, of how many Australians have done similar to Oscar and travelled to fight alongside Ukrainian forces?
So certainly there's reporting that it has been hundreds of Australians that have gone over to fight, but we do know that the Department of Home Affairs has said that they don't track these numbers, so there are no publicly available numbers. We know that a number of Australians have lost their life over there, and more broadly it's thought that there's probably about 20,000 foreign fighters fighting for the Ukrainian armed forces from about 52 different countries.
And the Prime Minister has said he's reticent to confirm whether Oscar is alive. Russia says he's alive. Is it advantageous to Russia to keep us kind of in the dark about it, in this grey space, not knowing?
Look, it is advantageous to Russia to do that. It's certainly not kind. It's certainly not in accordance with international law. However, when you think about how Russia has approached this conflict, which is an illegal invasion, it is a breach of the UN Charter, they have used significant amounts of propaganda. By saying that Oscar is alive, then they are drawing Australia into the negotiations in terms of how Australia might support Russia in a prisoner swap, or they're drawing them further into negotiations. So it is a bit of a ploy, I would suspect. Hopefully we do get some proof that Oscar Jenkins is alive, but Prime Minister is right to say that we can't assume this based on Russia's previous conduct.